Welcome to our fifth lecture in our Scholars in the Square series. Hello to those of you who are in the room, of course, and those of you who are joining us through Zoom and YouTube. Today, I'm pleased to welcome you to something that's really a first for us. We have a mother and daughter team, which is really quite exciting. Today, Dr. Amy Verdun and Zoey Verdun will share their research in 20 minutes, and there will be a 20-minute period in which they will engage in conversation with someone who's familiar with some of the interests and issues they address. In this case, the interlocutor is Dr. Zoey Verdun, a sociologist with a long track record of addressing communities often living on the margins of our society. After Amy, Zoe, and Cecilia talk for 20 minutes, I'll chair an open 20-minute conversation with the folks in the room and people on Zoom. Our speakers today are Dr. Amy Verdun, a professor in the political science department here at UVic, and Zoey Verdun, a research associate at Imperial College in London. Amy's been a faculty fellow with the CSRS, and her work explores the wide variety of political, social, and economic issues that one encounters in the many and often very nasty debates around European integration. Zoe works on issues related with food and healthy behaviors, diet, and other lifestyle considerations. Both mother and daughter share with Cecilia, myself, and many others here an interest in the impact of big social forces on people living under suboptimal conditions. Their work reflects our interests and the interests of UVic to find new ways to engage our shared history and our Indigenous neighbors. And so by way of a final comment, I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Osage peoples, whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. So please join me in welcoming Amy and Zoe.
Thank you very much. Zoe and I prepared a presentation, and with the help of Scott, we're going to try to stick within 20 minutes. And what we did was put a set of PowerPoint slides together. We don't have a paper yet, but we will, in the next 3 weeks, finalize this paper and hopefully send it out to a journal. So that's our goal. So you guys are the first to be part of that journey. But the journey started well before, and it's because we have some sort of good news and sad news that we're together here. So the good news is that we had a project with a lot of people, and everybody's put in a lot of work. The sad news is that one of our collaborators, Nilanjana Roy, at the moment is on an extended leave and can't be part of the project at this time. So we think of her as we work on this project, and we're very much indebted to her. So yeah, the topic is well-being of Bangladeshi migrants in Italy, religion, economic challenges. So you've seen the blurb, those of you who've seen the posters, and again, thanks to Scott and the team for putting that together and helping us advertise it a little bit more. Again, so how did it all began? So before turning to the main topic, so looking at health and well-being of Bangladeshi migrants to Italy, I was with my colleague Nilanjana Roy, who came to visit Italy, where I'd done my PhD, and we did some shopping. And I presented an earlier version of our project here in the center when I was a center fellow. And Nilanjana and I enjoyed going to the market. And we were in Florence at the leather market, and I said, well, why don't I buy you a really nice leather purse? And so I bragged about my amazing Italian. I've been 5 years in Italy and very fluent, you know, the culture and so on. So go there, we talk to these merchants in the market, and it takes no time at all. And she ends up speaking to them in Bangla, because they're from Bangladesh, and Nilanjana is from Kolkata, where the language is Bangla. So she bought me a purse for an absolutely rock bottom price. And I never got it because she spoke their language. So we had a number of these experiences, and at some point her husband, who's a journalist, said to her, like, well, if you like this kind of stuff, Amy does research for a living by talking to people. So why don't you guys figure out what's going on? And so one of the things that she noticed, particularly when we went traveling a little bit through Italy, was that we had these merchants who were selling really nice leather products, but they were looking as if it was maybe very difficult for them. And there were also quite a number of Bangladeshi migrants who were wrapping up their stuff and running as soon as the police was there, right? So we were wondering about how would they live and what would be their lives in Italy. So we did a pilot project, I'll talk to a little bit more, but we also ended up in Bologna, where we spoke to a number of people at small shops. So what are we going to do today? So just give you a bit of sense of who we are and how we came to study this. I give you a bit of the sort of background story, but I'll say a little bit more about the rest of the team. So it's part of this research project on health and well-being of Bangladeshi migrants in Italy, in order for us to highlight what we think is going on by looking at these migrants in Italy, in very specific. What we'd like to share a little bit about what Bangladesh is about. And we'd like to share with you something about migration drivers. So why are people leaving Bangladesh? Why are they coming to Italy? And also this is situated in a broader European migration sort of ecosystem, so to say. Then I want to turn to very briefly introducing the theory, and Zoe will do the methods, our findings, conclusion, and hopefully we stuck within the 20 minutes. We're happy to take more questions if we are a little bit short for time in our presentations. Okay, Bangladesh, I promised to talk very briefly to this when Zoe and I were doing our math on the numbers. So just because it's hard to imagine what we're talking about down the road when we tell you about our findings with the Bangladeshi migrants, to do that without understanding where our people are coming from. So Bangladesh, a population of 165 million, has a population growth of 0.95%. There's a lot of net migration, so people leaving. The people in Bangladesh are predominantly Bengali. Religion salience ranks fourth. There's a lot of weekly prayers. So it's really a religious community. So this religion and cultural relationships related to religion is very important for people in Bangladesh. It is also the sixth largest origin country for international migrants. So people, if you rank all of the people, go to a slide that shows that it is one of the sending countries. And among other things, there's a lot of young people who are moving abroad. So here's the Organization of Migration World Report on 2022. And on the right-hand side, you see Bangladesh is in the sixth position of sending countries. And on the left-hand side, I didn't highlight it, but somewhere in the ninth position is Italy. So people are coming from one country, going to other countries. So Bangladesh is amongst the countries that is sending a lot of people. And keeping in mind, this is absolute, right? So there's also a really large number of people moving, and Italy being up there in the ninth position. So we're, in a sense, we didn't necessarily target these countries. It's not like, oh, let's be a migration studies person, and then what would you want to do? It was kind of really bottom up. But as it so happens, it is not by accident that we came across a lot of Bengalis or Bangladeshis in Italy, and Italy is actually one of the countries that does attract a fair number of migrants. So if we then move to migration in Europe, so there has been a fair bit of migration into Europe, but it's not like what we see in United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, where there's an active search for people to come. So there's a policy points, all this kind of stuff. In Europe, the attitude has been, we're not actually a migration destination country or any of these countries in the EU or the European Union, before that European communities, but there have been a fair bit of temporary workers. So they've invited guest workers to come, very, like from a North American perspective, very unsophisticated way of attracting people to come. So people have come without clear planning that obviously they'll bring their spouses and children as well. So there's not been that same sort of vision of you draw people in and they'll likely make this their new home and then settle and be here for a longer time. So the idea of how you come to have migrants in your society is different from what people in Canada would expect to be the norm, so to say. Now with globalization, so the opening up of markets, there's been quite a bit more movement. And in the last 10 years in particular, we've seen a lot of people from all over the world moving to all over, and Europe is no exception. Within the EU, there's an additional development, and that is that as part of European integration, the free movement of labor from people within the EU is sort of free, like there's no obstacles to move. But a number of these countries, particularly those who are from the ex-Soviet Union bloc or the Warsaw Pact, or formerly Eastern countries that were behind the Iron Curtain, they have become member of the EU, and they're also still figuring out where to go. And so there's been a migration that's in the EU context not even seen as external migrants, but just regular citizens who are allowed to move around. So if we then look at what are some of the migration factors, so determinants of migration, This is what the literature has been focusing on. And so what we've noticed when we were trying to study our own little case study is that much less of the literature actually looks at the migrant and their experience. A lot of migration literature is about understanding flows, and actually you can't use flow in the migration literature. Anyway, all these things. Okay, so in Italy, so a lot of the migrants who move to Italy are particularly unaccompanied young Muslim men who come in first instance. There's a lot of literature on the hardship of taking the journey. Not everybody, but there is, we see boats and stuff and people being stranded at the borders and things like that. But the concern that we picked up on in our own pilot study was the difficulties around living conditions and working conditions. A high percentage of Bangladeshis remain unemployed, according to the Italian stats, or outside the formal labor market. Now, in 2015 to 2016, a lot of the migrants who came to Europe came in through southern European member states, so Greece and Turkey, which is not an EU state, but from Turkey then up, and so also ended up in Italy. So a host of the drivers are like war, low development, global warming, and of late 2020, we've also seen a lot of unaccompanied minors. Now, the Italians have mixed attitudes to foreigners. We've seen some racially motivated xenophobic attacks, but there's also people who are quite on the other side and feel that this is something that the Italian state should be able to accommodate. So it's very mixed. And there's also recently stronger support for anti-immigrant political parties, despite Italy itself actually having low birth rates. So the reproduction of the Italian peoples to kind of keep up their welfare state, they would benefit greatly from having more migrants. The EU itself, I mentioned already something about the guest workers, but if you look at it more generally, the EU is particularly, the EU that we have today is mostly Christian, and so a lot of the values are around religious Christians or not religious Christians, but those who've come from that background. So, and a lot of the newcomers are Muslim, and so Bangladeshis coming into the European setting are delivering, in a sense, a different cultural experience. And so we see a fair bit of sort of othering in this context. Now, in our project, our goal was to look at the Bangladeshi migrants in Italy. We didn't want to go for the precarious ones, because obviously there's a lot of concern around just arriving and safety around that. And just kind of the first year is really tricky. And there, I would say that's one type of things. But what we were interested in seeing what happens once they've actually overcome all of that and they're into year 3 or more. And these are people who are seemingly gainfully employed, or they seem to be fine, so to say. And what is their life then if it looks like you're in that sort of medium range period? So we did this pilot study that I mentioned with Professor Roy, and we discovered that they still faced a considerable number of challenges. I'm also thankful to Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly, who is here, whose big project contributed to making that publication possible. So the pilot study was to see if we could do something like this, because Nilanjana Roy is an economist who does development and econometrics, but she also never collected her own survey or did any field work, as I mentioned. Myself, most of my work is not on the global south. It doesn't look necessarily on migration, and I also have nothing with econometrics. So to kind of put these two together, we requested support from Short Insight Development Grant, which we obtained. And we ended up doing a survey with 1,000 people, roughly. So 5 years after these migration flows hit Europe, the project then focuses on health and well-being of these Bangladeshi migrants in Italy. Besides Professor Nilanjana Roy, the other collaborators in the project are Eric Jones, Gianni Betti, who's a poverty specialist, the statistician, and then Paola Alvarez and Laura Bartolini, who are from the International Organization of Migration in Rome. We were able to, this is the theoretical framework, sorry. We're drawing on this literature by Amartya Sen that looks at the capabilities approach, sort of a human development approach, where you focus on how people are able to choose their own destiny and try to see how they can get what they want from their own perspective. And so we were very keen to figure out to what extent the Bangladeshis were able to achieve their own goals. So a lot of our questions were to investigate if they are able to for example, send money home, so not use it so much for consumption. So we might be looking at it from a like Western perspective, saying, oh, how well are you doing? Like, how well do you live? Do you have like a lot of space? Do you go out to dinner? These kinds of things. Or if you yourself don't value that in this stage of your life, but you're actually making very clear trade-offs, but you're spending your money on giving it back home, that might give you the satisfaction you're looking for. So trying to include these kinds of indicators. And Professor Betty was also instrumental in having a whole battery of questions that look at that are similar to what the EU Silk does, as these are on the poverty indicators, so that we have very similar questions to what they have to investigate poverty, like if you've got like a pair of shoes, if you have a hot meal a day, so these kinds of things. So we know that in addition to your choice of lifestyle, it could also be whether you have some basic needs met. So we did the pilot, and then the next step was this quantitative study with 1,011 surveys. I also did a focus group following the research that we've done. And the way we did the survey was to include a project manager who was from this organization, ISMU, which an organization has been dealing with researching immigrants in Italy. And she helped us also ensure that the survey was in line with what they would normally find from their own field experience. And we had lots of questions about like their documentation and their income. And we had all these back and forth on what you could legitimately put in the survey without it being over the top. And also she had a whole range of interviewers who could help us reach out to the Bangladeshis in Milan and in Rome. So we used the centers approach so that the interviewers go to different centers on the territory, and they then participate. And then, so we also have an opportunity, we'll talk about that today, but to see whether it's representative of the Bangladeshis in Italy. And so we could also at some point kind of make some sort of generalization to the population, but that's not what we're into today, but that's another dimension of the survey that we looked into. We put the interview questions into Bangla, Italian, and English. English for human ethics, Italian because of the interviewers were all able to speak in any case Italian, and some of them spoke Bangla, but we knew that our interviewees might not speak one of the languages, and therefore we had 3 languages so they could check on the iPad or whatever, the Chromebook, to kind of toggle between the languages. 5 minutes. Okay, so that was in May and July 2022, and now I'm giving the floor to Zoey. Sorry, take us along.
Okay, thank you. So as Amy said, I will get into the results. I'll briefly go through some descriptive statistics to give you a feel for the sample, the 1,000 people that we were interviewing. And at the end, I'll describe some of the correlations that are somewhat of the more interesting. What do we see correlates with mental health, and how could that be explored further? So as Amy mentioned, a lot of the migrants are male. We see here, actually, we still managed to get 30% female, which is great for some balance. These graphs are a little bit small, but the general picture is there. We managed to get quite a nice wide age distribution. The median age is about 34. And on the right-hand side, we split it by females left, males right, and you see that the distribution doesn't change much. So it's nice. It's really quite a nice balanced set of respondents. We also looked at the marital status, also by gender. The most top 2 rows, the most obvious one, single, is about, well, it depends if you're male or female, but 36% of 13. Married is the large bulk of the rest. In Bangladesh, if you are together with a partner, you are pretty much always married. They don't do this, we're together, but we're not married. We do some sort of other cohabitation. So that's why you can see there, it's like, not even 1% most of the time. But yeah, so it's about not quite half, bit more married than singles. Not so surprising, Amy said that most of them are Muslim, and you see that in our data, right? 95 males, 91 females, a little bit of everything else, but definitely predominantly Muslim. The left, you don't actually have to look at, that's just all the different kinds of educational attainments people could have made, but for simplicity on the right-hand side, we grouped them into a little bit easier. So the top row is essentially not quite having reached high school, then 2 sort of versions of high school. And then we have some undergrad or BA, and then more than BA. And so later when we look at education, we'll look at whether you've done anything more than high school or not. But there you see it's quite spread across the group, sort of easily 20% in most categories. Then of course we have perceived happiness. So these are of course self-reported values, but what we see, which is I think positive is that most people seem to be happy, very happy, or neutral, and there's very few people who report that they feel very unhappy or unhappy. So that's good news. And similarly, when we ask them about their perceived life satisfaction, we find that the bulk of all the values start at 5, which is sort of neutral, going up towards 10, very satisfied with life. And very few people are, in some version, dissatisfied with their life. Then we also ask questions about whether they're better off now than when they were living in Bangladesh. Generally, we have 81% who feel they're better off than when they were in Bangladesh, but 9% says they're doing about the same, and only 8% says they feel they're doing worse. So I guess it seems like they think they made the right choice. We also then, because this survey, of course, was done in 2022, so COVID sort of, we just passed it, we also asked them how they feel today compared to how they were just before COVID broke out. There you see that people are slightly less positive, so only 43% feel they were doing better, but still at least 40% say they're doing the same. So it's not like they took a major hit, although now we do have almost 20% say they're doing worse than before COVID. Then we get to physical health, although the next slide is on mental health, which will be the focus of what I'm going to say next, but just to give us a little bit of balance. So in roughly 2022, when we asked them, compared to the last 4 weeks, or in the last 4 weeks, how would you describe your physical health? Very few people felt they were doing very poor, and even poor was only 7%. 26% thought they were doing all right physically, and actually the largest share thought they were doing good, and even some people felt very good in terms of their physical health. And then finally, mental health. So it was a similar question in the last 4 weeks. How would you describe your mental health? Yeah, there's slightly more people who feel very poor, but still it's not a huge share. A little bit more all right, but good is still quite well represented with 45%. And 52 people or so felt actually their mental health was very good. Just a few people who chose not to answer. And so getting to sort of the results, we should of course say that these results are preliminary, and and so of course we'd love to explore this more as we go on. But what we did is we looked at some correlations. So just a reminder that correlations doesn't mean causation. We can't prove something one way or the other. And of course, correlations can go either way, right? So that's something just to keep in mind as we go along. But where there's a correlation, these ones I should say are statistically significant, suggesting that it's not just chance. And where there's a correlation, it also makes it more interesting later to dive deeper into what could be going on, what else could possibly explain some of this. So in terms of positive correlations, that means that people who said, what I'll describe in a second, also reported better mental health. So maybe not so surprising, but people who had some sort of higher education, so at least started something that looks like a bachelor's degree or more, had reported higher mental health. Now, of course, we don't know, is it mental health that helps you go to school, or is school good on your mental health, or is there something altogether that's playing along? But it was interesting to note. The one that was, for me, hopefully straightforward is that people who can say they can see a counselor report higher mental health. What was also interesting here is that people who said they didn't know if they could see a counselor also reported better mental health. It was only the people who said they could not access a counselor who reported worse mental health. So it could be that people who don't know simply never tried to access it, but it was still, good to see that there was no worse reported effects. And we also found that people who had at least some mastery of the Italian language had reported higher mental health. And actually, if they reported really good mastery of the language, they reported even higher mental health. So that, yeah, again, which way does that go? If you struggle with mental health, maybe learning the local language is tough. But probably I can imagine if you speak the local language, life is a little bit easier than if you don't. And that, of course, can have an effect on your mental health. We also found one significant negative correlation, which is that compared to people who do have a job, those who are unemployed reported worse mental health. And again, the correlations could probably go both ways, but you can imagine this at least seemed quite plausible and interesting to dive into. And something that's, for me, was a little surprising because I don't do mental health, but I study a lot of other kind of health and lifestyle impacts on health. And what we often see is that there's a big divide among gender. And here we found no effect of gender on people's self-reported mental health. So even though there was nothing there, that in a sense for me was something to say it was there. But yeah, so we'd love to explore these further. But that's where we're at, and I thought those were really quite interesting to share. And so then just to wrap up, we had just over 1,000 people in the survey, and in general, people were quite happy and satisfied in life. We also found mostly positive correlations related to mental health for the ones that we did find. But as we also said, there were some people who felt the mental health wasn't so good. We found positive correlations, right, with being able to see a counselor, speaking the local language, and having some higher education. And as I just said, we didn't find any correlation between gender and people's self-reported mental health. Any conclusions I missed?
I think we're good.
Great, that was it.
Thank you for your patience.
All right. Thanks very much. That's great. We can have a whole other session on what it's like to work with your mom or your daughter. I can't even imagine working with my son on anything. So thanks very much for that. Now I sort of turn the floor over to Cecilia.
Oh, thank you. So a lovely presentation. Thank you. Really interesting project, and I look forward to seeing more outcomes that you bring forward. So I guess overall, it's a good news story for immigrants from poor or lower middle income country coming into Italy. And actually, most of the stories we hear about immigrants is not a good news story. It's usually quite negative about difficult experiences. We hear some positive ones, but and I think a lot of immigrants, especially coming from Africa or other even poorer places, probably are not doing so well. But can you just talk a little bit more about why do you think it was that was sound like it was a bit surprising to you? And then, I mean, what do you think about what might be going on there?
Yeah, sure, I can start. I think one of the things that's important to remember is that this is the people who've been here 3 years to 15. So these are people who've sort of established themselves in some way. I think those who either struggled the most or, those horrible stories we hear about boat accidents, those are the early stages. So the people who maybe struggled the most maybe simply are not here anymore by the time 3 years comes around. And so we are seeing in some ways the survivors, and they might just be doing a little bit better.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's the survivor bias was one of the things that when we were doing our early work, one of my colleagues said, oh, but that, it's obviously survivor bias. And we're going, oh, obviously. I mean, that's great. And another thing I wonder about is are we seeing a mechanism that reminds me of our students, right? So a lot of people coming in are relatively young, and they're making a huge investment. They also spend a lot of hours, like when we did that little pilot, they spent an insane amount of hours working, and they were like earning a good amount of money, but it was at a great expense. And in this project, one of the things that was also surprising, we didn't put it on the slide, is that we actually have quite a range of people. We saw 34 as a median, but across the whole age range, we don't see a difference in mental health. Like, it's not like the old people or the young people are all stressed out. Age doesn't matter. So that's something I still have to think about, because my first model was young men working hard. Obviously it works if they're able to cope. But I mean, I think partly it's also there's an element to which it's also Italy. So the Italians have a weird relationship to government and rules. So there are some things that they just close their eyes and let it happen. And then there's also people in the Italian sort of infrastructure who are perfectly happy to allow some of them to kind of come in and then find their documentation and become legal. And that's, it's sort of an interaction. And so as much as you have people voting for Italian extreme right-wing parties, and you get those on the news, and they are not helping, there are also a lot of countervailing forces. And so when we went to Bologna, for example, it's very left-leaning, very red, as they call them in Italy. So it's a mix of things that make it possible for these groups to do well.
Thank you. It sounds like from your description that there are, well, you work with one organization, but there are other supports for the immigrants in communities where they come, which you see in lots of other. So would you talk a little bit about those community organizations that emerge from civil society and provide supports that the immigrants wouldn't have, especially when they first arrived, but even maybe still important after the third or fifth year of being
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, so original design was that we do all of this, and then we would also have like a focus group with support givers, and we haven't done that stage yet. So I've done a focus group where we asked the interviewers to come and debrief with us. And a very interesting conversation emerged where they were also talking to one another about where they're failing society. So, for instance, there's a fair bit of own network that is the most important. So other Bangladeshis. So they work for an owner who's a Bangladeshi. They live in a house with Bangladeshis and so on. So they're quite, I mean, as much as they are, we've seen about understanding of Italian helps, and we've also done things like friends and all these things. But they are particularly a group that stays to themselves. Mm-hmm. And so they were among one another criticizing that they are too far away from the culture of the land. And they said, well, we may give ourselves a bad reputation because we should integrate more. And they meant like change a little bit more our ways to others. So partly it's a very strongly knit community that will help each other no matter what. Yeah. And then the Italian community comes back and offers like language courses and places for integration where you can find jobs and so on. And so a couple of these centers where the interviewers were centers for immigrants where they can come and get support or talk to one another. And they also interviewed people in like reading groups and this kind of thing. So the interviewers were able to connect with some of these groups that are also helping one another. So I think in this particular setting, we saw a fair bit of these elements of social fabric, but some of the elements of social fabric are Bangladeshi fabric.
Yeah.
So that's also the case.
I'm intrigued about the gender, and I'm looking forward to seeing more analysis. How about employment? I know that it's predominantly male who migrate, but what jobs is the employment or unemployment rate different by men and women? And also, what jobs are they gendered when they work in that society?
Yeah, so we need to look at it even more carefully because we had a very long list of different jobs they could take. And for the first part, we decided to keep it more simple. We had unemployed, we had homemakers, we had sort of students or working students, and then sort of everybody else. Yeah. The unemployment seemed sort of balanced across the gender. I think, yeah, but I remember it was maybe, it was a good sanity check, I think, if you think stereotypically, just about all the homemakers were women. There was like maybe 2 males. So we still have to figure it out, what does that mean? Because if you're a homemaker, then maybe, somebody else is caring for you. So, because we couldn't find really, there was a sort of a gentle suggestive effect that being a homemaker was better for your mental health. Mm-hmm. But we were thinking, is that really being a homemaker that sort of is behind that? Or is the fact that you're a homemaker suggesting somebody else is caring for you? Yeah. Or somehow giving you support? Because obviously if you're a homemaker, you're not earning anything. How do you make it work? So that we need to look at more carefully. Mm-hmm. So right there, other than the homemaker, we didn't see a lot of difference between men and women. But I think when we look maybe specifically at some of the more of the hard construction jobs, or if there's cleaning jobs, maybe there we might very well see a difference in gender.
Yeah, I think you would, and you may see difference in earnings and those kinds of things, which would be really important to take a little bit.
We have a question on earnings, and we ask questions about their own earnings and their household earnings, and some of the earnings they don't make a lot of sense. So we have to do a bit more digging. Yeah. So that we thought it was easy. You ask your own income and your income of your household, and then you look at the numbers, and it doesn't. Yeah. There's a lot of work that we need to do to figure out where people might misunderstood the question, mm-hmm. And the same thing with we wanted to know how much of their money they're sending abroad. And we wanted to know how much money are they spending on their children with them here, and their children that are not here but are somewhere else, or their parents that are somewhere else. And all of that work we still need to do, but we collected a huge amount of information about those relationships. And we also, the mental health care situation, we were wondering, okay, so if you've got a couple of friends and you have a partner, you might be happier than when you're by yourself. Mm-hmm. But it didn't work out that way at all, because married doesn't mean that your marriage partner is with you. No. So your marriage partner could be away. Yeah. So all of those things you need to disentangle. And we noticed that those who have a married partner away might also be the ones who are, after COVID, feeling that they might want to change their plans to leave, to stay shorter in Italy than they originally planned. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of these intricate relationships that are are
Yeah.
needing to be explained.
Yeah, it was interesting because, like, and I try not to get too technical, but when you control for different variables, you see effects sort of come and go, right? And so when we were not controlling for people's marital status, we saw certain effects, like having one or two friends was, people reported better mental health than having no friends. And we were like, okay, that's, that seems to be kind of obvious. Having no friends is not very good for my mental health.
Yeah.
But when we added, your marital status back in, that started to disappear, that effect. And so we thought, okay, but maybe because your marital status could mean that your partner is abroad, then maybe, being married is maybe more important than having one or two friends. Maybe the marriage part of your life is more contributing to your mental health. But because we don't know whether the marital status is both local or one local, one abroad, it's harder to figure out what exactly the story is telling.
Yeah, I can ask a couple more questions, right? Yeah. So I'm interested how othering and this whole idea of stigma and then how it is enacted through discrimination works for this group of people. I don't know if you asked directly or measured directly stigma and discrimination. And if you did, then how do people experience it, and do they have any strategies to try to push it off, or that may be through their community organizations or whatever.
Yeah, we had relatively positive results on discrimination. Maybe Zoe remembers.
Yeah, I'd have to think a little bit off the top of my head, but from what I remember, we had a question on sort of cultural clashes, which included discrimination. And we were surprised that I'd say almost just under half reported not running into those.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were obviously some who said they had some, but they were manageable. And then there were some who said these clashes were anxiety creating. But when we tried to see what the relationship was with mental health, it was not so clear that was a really strong driver associated with mental health.
And we also asked some questions, the question about food and being able to express oneself in a religious and cultural way.
Yeah.
And there we found they had ample opportunity to express themselves culturally.
I would say over 95% said that they could express themselves culturally.
So I wonder if that's something to do with their communities within the Italian society, and they're not interfacing very much with Italians and their everyday life.
Yeah, we have a question about how many friends that are Italian, and so quite a large number had them, but it was also unclear what it did for mental health, because we thought, okay, that would be an easy one, but the understanding Italian was much more important than whether you had an Italian friend. So
Okay, I think my last big question or kind of question would, well, first, just how easy is it to actually stay in Italy for a long period of time? How is it hard to get status to actually become a
So they have different status, different ways to get into Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had figured out all the possible ways in which they could possibly have documentation. And the project manager, Georgia, who was helping us out, was so nervous. She says, don't ask these questions. If you get the data, destroy it right away. And so we had to talk to you with ethics about it and so on. So this business about documentation was among the most difficult to deal with. Yeah, because it is very clear that they are not legal.
Yeah.
A number of them are not legal.
Yeah.
And we figured that out also when we did the original pilot, because we would ask questions about how much do you earn, how much do you earn per month, per hour, like how many days do you work, and we would ask them about the relationship with their boss, and it would often be and it was like they weren't actually legal. They weren't on the payroll,
right?
So they were working, but it wasn't recorded in a proper way. Now that could still be that they're legal and that they're just not legally working, or that they were actually illegal in their working it. So in those interviews that we did ourselves, we learned that some of them couldn't even leave the country because they don't know if they could actually come back, because they need the documentation in order to be able to come back. So they just couldn't move, which was another stressor. But in these interviews, we basically collected a lot of the information on the basis of this documentation, and the declared answer, which we do not know if is that the correct answer, looks quite okay. A lot of people have, either citizenship like of Italy, or they have a permanent certificate, or they have a student visa, or they have expired documents. There were quite a number of people with expired documents. So they had documents at some point and now it's expired. and they can have a permanent residence status, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it has to do with you need to be able to be somewhere legally, and then you can collect the documentation. And so if you're not yet legal, then you can also not add up the 5 years that you need to become a citizen, for instance, because you need to be legal in the first place.
Yeah. And would you say that, in Canada, we hear a lot about the exploitation of immigrants, and I do research on sex work, and they're talking about that all the time, as if everybody who comes across the border is exploited. But it could well be that that's still the case for some of the immigrants who come in, especially those who leave early or you haven't got access to, right? So is there any, was there any conversations or discussions about like that group of people that you may not get access to in your study?
Yeah, so we purposely didn't try to get to the most precarious.
Yeah.
So these are the people that are walking around in the centers, right? Could be a market center, could be an employment area, could be a mosque, or so they're not afraid to see anybody.
Yeah.
And so that makes for that's the survivor bias again, right? So
Yeah.
these are the people who don't mind showing their face. And in that, we also, when we asked our questions, we had questions about how their journey went to come to Italy, and a number of them just took the airplane, right? For you to take the airplane, you are not as precarious as when you're traveling, by foot all the way and so on. One of the interviewers that interviewed the people, he had actually walked from Bangladesh to Italy. He spent a whole year walking, right?
Yeah.
But these people, a lot of them flew.
Yeah.
But they also are therefore incredibly indebted. Some people had sold property, houses, whatever, to get this one man to fly to Italy.
Yeah.
And now he's going to earn money and send it back and so on. So it's a very complicated economical infrastructure. And they may be indebted for 5 years before they finally start paying money back. And then they made it in a proper way, expensive. But, so it's also, And we have also the questions about whether they came from the city or from the countryside and from which area. So that also gives us a bit of information.
So it's kind of like the global success story of the immigrant, right?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, my last question is really about policy. So I like Sen's work and the capabilities perspective, and you did talk about what services were, or services, policies, whatever, seem to be linked to mental health. So if you were to think about the social policies that could be enacted in Italy to further the inclusion, of the immigrants in society, and so that they could actually contribute what they want to in regard to their labor, but also other characteristics. So what would some of those policies look like?
You want to go first?
I'll give you an example. So you talked about the importance of language, right? So maybe having access to language classes that were free and whatever, or maybe if education is extremely important, then maybe education. So just thinking about it in that way, as a way of turning Sen's capabilities perspective into one where the society itself could be helping. Yeah.
More structure, less agency.
Yeah.
I mean, I can go. I think the one that comes out, screaming, it was unbelievably a strong correlation was the counselor.
Yeah. So health services, right?
Health services, mental health services, being able to just kind of brain dump your issues and knowing that there's access to that. Those two things were crucial.
And it may tie back to the language, because maybe the mental services are only offered in Italian.
Yeah.
And so then if you don't have some mastery of the language, then even if the service was there, you still wouldn't have access to it.
Right.
Or you need to then have services by counselors who speak Bangla. Right?
Yes, then you might have to train some of the slightly more legal immigrants who speak Bangla into providing mental health services, because I don't know how many Italian counselors wish to learn Bangla.
Or the other way around, right? Because Bangladeshis coming to Italy who are trained as counselors.
Yeah, and also I think making employment opportunities more available, and all, which is all linked to, as you say, language and inclusion.
Yeah, and some of the things are quite remarkable, because when we were thinking about how to interview, we first thought, because we were a good shirk inside France, I was gonna, we had enough knowledge about Bangladeshi students in Italy. We were gonna get Bangladeshi students do all the interviewing. A fantastic plan. And then we talked to these Israeli people, they go, absolutely not. Because they're biased in a number of ways. The networks, they're too close. They might not speak to each other. No, absolutely not. Moreover, after COVID, a lot of Bangladeshi students have disappeared.
Yeah.
But we were doing the interview, the survey translation here, right, in Victoria. And of course, there were Bangladeshis here. And I said, oh, but I could ask my brother who lives in Milan. And so the network is tremendous. So it shouldn't be too hard to get Bangladeshi students who've done a psychology degree in Victoria to move to Italy and serve the community there. Should not be problematic at all. It's just, again, a question of where do you see the need and how are you going to give people credentials and allow them to serve the community. I mean, this is a really large community. So if the language is an issue, it shouldn't be too hard to solve that.
Right.
Thank you very much, Celia. So you can stick around to the larger part of the conversation now, where we turn our attention to the folks in the room. So, Taviani?
Thank you so much for your presentation. So I saw the correlations you drew between some level of economic security and mental health. I'm just curious about the level of practice, religious practice, and is there any linkage between that and mental health and how that differs across gender?
Yeah, so we need to do a proper search because we just, for this presentation, we focused on mental health because we have this other project with these collaborators that looks at poverty and everything around that. And then we focused on the mental health for now. And we did look at a few of these religious and cultural dimensions, and they seemed not to be that important for finding a correlation between how mental health was doing among the group. But I think it's interesting to kind of put it separately and then pick it apart. Like, to what extent are men or women responding differently to not having access to religious services, or like those who are younger, or people with lower education, because we had them all bunched together. But if you maybe separate them out, then it might be that it's for some groups it correlates much more for mental health than it does for other groups.
Can I jump in too? Yeah. So just from a purely data perspective, when a question has many people answering the same, it becomes very difficult to use it in your sort of econometric methods because you need variation in the answer. And so the good thing is that 95% of people said they could engage spiritually with their needs. The problem is that 95% said the same thing. So I can't see it in the correlation sense. But what we can do, like Amy said, is just look at the numbers, split it itself. Just say, like, how many said yes among the men and women, and see, is there, where that 5% was, although it's a small group, maybe it was all women, or maybe it was all people with no education, or maybe, and then, see if we can say a little bit more. Unfortunately, we didn't, I don't remember thinking we asked, I don't think we split it further, like between prayer and food and this and that. I think it was more generally engaging spiritually.
We did originally, but then the lady from Israel said, your survey is going to get so long, nobody's going to answer it. So
in the end, they got condensed. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm curious about the first picture that you showed with bags. Is it some sort of temporary market that they set up in the morning and they take away in the afternoon?
Yeah, so there's two sets of markets. So in Florence, there's a market that gets built up every day.
Right.
And a number of the Bangladeshis who came, their job is to set up the market. So they have three jobs. One of them is to set up the market, and then they go somewhere else to work in some factory, and then they come back and they take down the marketplace itself. But then some of these markets have a little store, like a concrete building with a door, and opens and closes, and they're just, you can just walk in and it's like a store.
So it's like some people are businessmen, some people are freelancers, some people are
so we almost never saw the businessman.
Oh.
So even if they were working in a store for this leather business, they were just selling. So they got the keys, opened it up, were selling, and then they locked it up and they left again. But it was also very interesting where they got it from, because they all looked the same.
Right.
All looked the same. And so when before we interviewed the people, we went down the market a couple of times and we asked everywhere and tried to buy things as well. And they're all the same items, and they all come from the same place. So, and that's actually a lot of Chinese are involved in actually making the bags. And they said Brato. And we would then, at some point, they said, oh, I like this. Oh, you want it with pink and yellow? Oh, come back tomorrow. And they'll go to pink and yellow. And they'll go make it. And they'll go back. So even the sort of the economy behind this is absolutely fascinating. I want to go to that factory. But, I don't do this for a living. I think this is already more than I've, bitten off more than I can chew. But it's super fascinating, because you could also imagine what that factory might look like. And I have a colleague here, Marlea Clark, who does research into developing countries, places of where you make clothing, right, in various places. And she she could tell you the circumstances in those factories are far suboptimal. But this is in Italy. Like, why would it be the same circumstances that you would expect in another country? But I don't know the circumstances. Other than that, there's the stores and the market have the same bags.
Right.
They're made locally. They are actually made locally. They can make a change, come up next.
So they can say made in Italy on.
They are actually made in
legit.
Italy. They are
Yeah.
made in Italy. And that's
Assembled in it.
Just
Yeah.
no Italian person has touched it.
and no Italian person has touched it.
Right.
But it's made in Italy.
That's the lie of the tourism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the actual the bigger people, the people who own the place, they're not doing the day-to-day labor.
Who owns
Yeah.
the place?
What's that?
Who owns the place?
Some of them are actually Bangladeshis, but
Ah.
they're higher level, like they're wealthier Bangladeshis, so they have certain, so they work for a Bangladeshi person. So it's not all of them, but some of them. Yeah.
Rachel?
Yes, we have a question. Were there any questions regarding access to mosque versus daily prayer as a home practice? She's asking, as she wonders how comfortable people were being publicly Muslim rather than potentially privately Muslim.
So there is a mosque nearby, so they can just pray in the mosque. So it's not a problem of lack of access to the mosque. And whether they're feeling comfortable being a Muslim, portraying themselves as Muslim, I don't know, because we didn't ask that part. But on the discrimination question, we found a lot of people were not feeling discriminated against, much more than I would have expected. That they were much more less likely to say that they were discriminated against than I would have expected them to say.
Yeah, this is something that I find so fun. I've so loved watching this project develop from when you were at the center to now. And I wonder if there's any part of you that doesn't believe that story.
The adult discrimination, I don't believe for a minute.
Yeah. So
I
then
don't believe for a minute.
what's happening under the surface?
Yeah.
Can I,
Sorry.
so again, this is not my field, so maybe it's just me being naive, but I feel like maybe they have a certain level of expectation already about discrimination. They already think, people are going to judge me, people are going to, so given what they were expecting, maybe their answer is no, I don't feel discriminated because, it's not worse than I thought it would be.
Yeah, it's possible that it doesn't meet their own threshold,
Yeah.
so that we would have much more refined sense of that. But
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a
No, we don't.
it's
we
a
don't
genuine
ask,
good
We don't
question.
ask the kind of questions that are like factually correct. Like, has somebody yelled at you?
Yeah.
Have you ever been told you're not allowed to enter? Like, if we had that kind of questions, we could use that to make our own sort of judgment call. But because it's just them self-reporting what they feel, it's
So
hard to know.
I've been to this market and many other places like it in Europe, and my sense is that the people who are often Bangladeshi or insert newcomer brown person in here, they just are not seen. My sense is that they're kind of invisible to the surrounding, whether it's French or Italian populations.
Yeah.
And so maybe they're just used to being invisible, so they don't perceive that as being neutralized or discriminated against.
Yeah.
They simply operate within their environment.
I mean, it goes on different levels, right? Because we look at this market, I actually did some research into this market by anthropologists and also the time, the period over time. Because when I studied in Italy, it was not Bangladeshi. So there came a time where Bangladeshi started to be the dominant group in this market.
Yeah.
And so people studied the switch over from the Italians that were in the market selling to the Bangladeshis and others, but a lot of the Bangladeshis in this market. And it leads to other ways of complaining about it. So people then say, oh, but this market is no longer the same. And they basically mean it's no longer Italian selling. And they're rude and other people would say, well, about 2 years ago, the Bangladeshis who were selling here were higher class. And so they were more courteous and they had better skills and their abilities were better and so on. And now it's no longer the same. So they were not even talking about necessarily Bangladeshis as a phenomenon, but within the Bangladeshis, the kind of class that it had been attracting and how they behaved, and then that was a problem. And
Right.
so a lot of layers.
Yeah, super interesting. Ashraful?
Yes, I have quite a few questions. You'll be in the center tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just limit to one question. It's more about methodological question. You talk about control variables. So I'm curious to know actually what are the control variables you control here, and is method limited to the correlation, or it also goes to the regression, moderation variables, or interactions?
Okay, so I mean, I was using regression methods, but restricting my conclusions to correlations, because to get into causality is a very different world, and I don't have the right variables were set up to do that. We did indeed include other variables that we didn't talk about here. You know, we have things like age we showed, but not in the end results, and gender, marital status. We also looked at number of people living in your household together. We had language. I mean, I have a whole list I wrote on my phone just in case, because off the top of my head, they're not all going to stick. But yeah, we had a lot of the questions that we thought, you know, could influence things. We threw in there just to either see them, you know, do they have effect, or at least are they associated with better mental health, or if not, at least they're then, you know, controlling, so that when we do find other effects, we know that we've kind of got it going. But if you're there tomorrow, I can make sure I bring the whole list and we can go through it. So.
You can nerd out on the data. It's good.
But it was interesting because we forgot to put gender in, because we got all the descriptive statistics, and now we were going to look at the most important relationships. So we were doing things without gender, without marital status, and then at some point we go, oh, we forgot the gender. This is crazy. And then it didn't matter so much. Go like, that's weird.
And then I realized that gender itself had no significant
one thing I
correlation.
feel like they need to control, because I did quite a few research on the Bangladeshi,
Yeah.
and I'm Bangladeshi myself.
Yeah.
So, and also I traveled to Italy and France and all those markets and did my survey as well. So most of the time when you go for survey, they lie.
Yeah,
They're
That's the
giving
biggest
truth.
problem with self-reporting.
Number one. Second thing is you like most of the female there are actually housewife.
Yeah.
Their status, the way they come, not as a worker,
Yeah.
but a spouse visa.
Yeah.
So, and if 30% of the sample are female,
Yeah.
so the whole result, like how exactly to control them, moderation or interaction, I think that would have an effect.
Yeah. So we have the category homemaker. And that's the basically the housewife.
It's true, because off the top of my head, I remember we had roughly 300 women, and I think roughly 100 or more answered homemaker. So that does sound like quite a number of the women, but it's true that there's still a section of women who didn't say homemaker. So it'd be interesting to see what they did say for employment. Maybe there's something that looks not so different from home. Maybe you're cleaner, but it's like 5 hours a week. Of course, that we wouldn't know. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to split the data into men and women a bit more and
Like
see,
dummy variable, like
try to just see, can we tell the story, even if not, you know, maybe fully causally, just better understand it. But yeah, thank you. I think that's really interesting, Rachel.
Yeah, thanks for this. A couple of things on that too. It might be interesting to think about with the women, are they, I don't know if you can ask a question if they came partnered or not, right? Or because for a lot of the young men, they came on their own, but do you know that about the women or not? You can say, yes, these young men came by themselves to do the work or whatever, but is that also the case for the women or not? I might guess it's no. Then the other thing I'm wondering is if you two have looked at all into literature around kind of Muslim perspectives on mental health and Muslim perspectives on the very idea that one would need to be worried about their mental health. No, but honestly, there's quite a lot of you know literature out there around. So them saying, yeah, I'm pretty happy, or no problem, or my mental health is great. There's some good literature that would say, you know, within kind of Islamic perceptions of what it means to have a good life or to not question things, like why that might be.
Yeah, so I guess we'll start with the married one. I mean, if you remember a little bit of the descriptive statistics, there were more married women than there were married men. So that really does suggest that we don't know, you know, where they were coupled and when, but we do know that at the time of the survey, they said they were married. As for the mental health question, I think you're right. That if you sort of been raised in a way that says, you know, we don't think about these things. On the other hand, I think there was that one question about how do you sort of feel now versus before COVID. And I think in some ways that's an interesting question because it doesn't technically ask you about mental health. It's just saying, you know, how are you doing? But mental health, especially related to COVID, was a big deal. And so, you know, we did see that sort of little bit of a shift, a little bit less positive, a little more negative with the COVID question rather than just how are you after coming from Bangladesh. So I think that's almost like a safer question to ask because you get a little bit, maybe, hopefully, a little bit less of the lying because they don't think you're asking about one thing. Maybe they think you're asking something else. So
That's smart.
And also the interviewers, they were half of them were Bangladeshis, and then there were Algerians and people from Turkey, and there was a woman from Iran. So it was a mix of people who had a lot of experience interviewing sort of people who are newcomers or migrants in the Italian context. So at least it wasn't like my white face showing up with my heavy accent and my no Bangla. So they would have obviously lied to me. But when we were doing our 18 pilot, we had, for every person we met, we more or less had an hour, and Milanjan would do all of the language interviewing in Bangla. And if they had it was one time a younger man who was the son of, and he was also happy to talk. So he was speaking Italian, I could speak Italian. So I did the son and she was doing the father. And if you take a lot of time, you get a whole story. The story adds up. And so one of the older men at some point was getting really negative about, how things have gone down the drain and so on. And the young man was actually having a great time. He says, no, I live great in Italy. He was like having a good. So I think it's also less likely that they are not frank if there's a genuine engagement. And so we realize that for this kind of work, you need to make sure that the people who are talking to the people are doing it in a sort of respectful way, because otherwise I also, if I were in them, also would, we all do surveys going, yeah, tick, 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 done, right? So it has to be with some form of respect.
Right. So
wonderful work.
Thank you. Yeah. And so those of you who are fellows of the center and friends of fellows of the center can come and hang out tomorrow, where we're going to tease this out for another hour. So thanks very much. That was wonderful. And this last slide is going to be the slide that gives you some sense of what's happening next week. Very cool. And next week we have a friend and center fellow, Jingjing Li from Leiden, who's coming to talk about emotion feminism in the Buddhist philosophy of consciousness only. So join us for that, same time, same place. And thanks very much to you.